Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Melissa Begg, and I have the great honor of being the Dean of the Columbia University School of Social Work. We are delighted to welcome a truly distinguished scholar, Dr. Rucker Johnson, as our guest speaker in the Dean's Lecture Series on the Scholarship of Race and Racism. This series has been created to highlight the research of prominent scholars examining and promoting the well-being of Black Americans. We are thrilled that Dr. Johnson could be with us today. I'm grateful for this opportunity for our community to come together to explore the major nodes and intersections in the complex system of racist structures and policies that result in inequities, with a particular focus on disparities in economic opportunity, educational outcomes, criminal justice, healthcare access, and wellness. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, a phenomenal colleague and a cherished faculty member here at Columbia School of Social Work, Dr. Ronald Mincy. Dr. Mincy is the Maurice V. Russell Professor of Social Policy and Social Work Practice here at CSSW. He is also the director of the Center for Research on Fathers, Children, and Family Wellbeing, co-principal investigator of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study, and a member of the Columbia Population Research Center. Renowned for his groundbreaking conceptualizations and perspectives on some of our nation's most challenging social concerns, Professor Mincy created, conceptualized, and advanced the development of research on fragile families, disadvantaged families with low-income fathers. He's been a leader in calling attention to the plight of young Black men and other vulnerable populations. Dr. Mincy is the author of numerous articles and book chapters and editor of the book Black Males Left Behind. Over the course of his career, Dr. Mincy has served on leading advisory boards and councils, including the National Poverty Center at the University of Michigan, the Transition to Fatherhood Project at Cornell University, and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. He has been widely recognized for his influence on social policy. And earlier this year, we were delighted when the Society for Social Work and Research presented him with the Social Policy Researcher Award, which honors distinguished researchers who've made outstanding contributions to social policy at the local, national, or international level. Dr. Mincy, it's a pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for that generous introduction. And Rucker, she stole all of my time. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rucker Johnson, who's the Chancellor Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. He is a prolific author, particularly on the economics of education, and has been inducted into the American Academy of Political and Social Science and into the National Academy of Education. I've been following Rucker's career for the past 20 years. I first come to my attention really when I was at the Ford Foundation and looking to establish a mentoring program for underrepresented scholars. And my friend and colleague, Sheldon Danziger, just pointed him out as one of the end games where we would like to go. So Rucker, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Columbia. And without further ado, we are going to ask that we would hold questions until the last half hour or so of the talk. I'll be moderating them but let's give Rucker a good hour to join us. Rucker, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Begg. Thank you, Ron, for just a wonderful introduction. And I just wish we could be in person, but this is definitely a delight to be with you. And I am looking forward to the discussion. And I'm gonna just begin to share screen. So I'm just delighted to be able to share this really new work that has built on some of my prior work. I guess by way of motivation, I would want to first highlight that historically, school funding mechanisms have been implicitly tied to longstanding assumptions about which communities and students are deserving of adequate educational investments, who has the greatest capacity to learn, and which students we set high expectations for and hold a high standards versus low expectations and low standards. And school segregation and unequal school resources are the nerve center of inequitable educational opportunity that perpetuates structural racism. And it's a systems-based approach to inequality that considers the intersection of race and class, of pre-K and K-12, of public education and health investments that are essential to develop the requisite policy prescriptions for sustainable equity-based reform. Now, the currency for the future of America's workforce lies in the wealth deposited in the quality of our public educational investments made today and the equity within them. And so we have my aspiration here, both in this work and my broader agenda, is to connect our shared history to today's contemporary challenges. And really what presents ourselves today, an opportunity to fix a broken school finance system that is failing to meet the educational needs of school children who are trapped in many places across this country in under-resourced school districts. And it's without strategic, multifaceted policies and intervention, inequality in educational opportunity between poor and affluent students, between Black and white Hispanic students will continue to grow unchecked. Now, what I'm trying to zero in on is the connections between neighborhood segregation that fuels school segregation that then creates a cascading set of consequences with regard to educational opportunity inequality, disparities in student performance that then have implications and ramifications with regard to disparities in access to higher education. And then those unfold with the labor market disparities that are stark. And there's the intersection between those and the disparities that we observe in the criminal justice setting, and the cycle continues. And it's really this connection across the life course, from neighborhoods and school quality to higher education, to the labor market, to the criminal justice setting, to the adult economic status we see, and how that reverberates across generations without an effective intervention. So what we need is to develop multi-pronged, multi-dimensional aspects that can speak to what begins as racial stigma to break those aspects down, where we start with the racial stigma, as I said, neighborhood segregation, school segregation, higher ed, labor markets, criminal justice, and it's where we develop how to disrupt those directionalities. So when we start with the racial stigma component, we first kind of have a beginning point when we look to Brown v. Board, right? And then we think about this Fair Housing Act of the late 60s. And then we think about our endeavor to pursue integration, though delayed, the impacts it has when coupled with school funding reform and quality pre-K investments. The last time I was with the Columbia group, I was presenting my book project really about those connections from the earlier era. Today's talk is really about using a recent school funding reform in California, which is among the boldest and largest school funding reform in terms of size and scope in a generation, and looking at the impacts for each grade, for each subject across the continuum of pre-K through 12. Now, when we think about the earlier era and what implications it has for the contemporary cohorts, the key components are that we have to track people over time so that we can disrupt the neighborhood connections and the way school boundaries as an additional segregation tool to hoard opportunity. It's not about the segregation as much as it is about the hoarding of opportunity. So those have connections with affirmative action into higher education policy to deal with the legacy of those past policies, discrimination laws into the labor market, the job training programs, the sentencing policy reform, the minimum wage laws and pay discrimination, anti-pay discrimination, right? The safety net and expansions of public investments of health for children. So there's a lot of different components to disrupt these cycles of inequality that are generationally being experienced. Today's talk is really zeroing in and zooming in on the school funding aspects of that inequality. And it's connected directly to the fact that the contemporary policy influences on school segregation run through the ways in which a too heavy reliance on historically local property tax wealth can lead to significant differences in school inputs and teacher quality. When we think about the contemporary policy influences on school segregation, they include unregulated charter school growth that sometimes has been segregative, school closings that have been in particular areas, gerrymandered school district boundaries that have been designed to fuel more segregation. The ways in which there's been racialized tracking beginning the earliest elementary school grades often, increasingly, the zoning policies and exclusionary zoning, provision of government services that a lot of our housing, affordable housing policies have been concentrated in low-income neighborhoods without opportunity-rich environments for kids to thrive. We have the real estate practices that have to be counteracted, the mortgage lending discrimination. And all of that is built on the legacy of the prior restrictive covenant and segregated housing projects and the transportation infrastructure. So the time to act is now. What this work today is going to zero in on how education can play a substantial role in the racial ethnic achievement gap and improve student learning for all children, and the ways in which it's connected, right, to the student trajectories of achievement and how it's connected to school funding. Now, you should remember that there's a lot of debate around whether money matters. I would just highlight that a lot of the attention using time series, aggregate, state level aggregates of school spending growth alongside what appears to be stagnant student achievement and stagnant and persistent achievement gaps misses the point that you can't get at the causal effect of school spending without really tracing longitudinal data at the student level, matched and linked with the school environments that prevail during their school age years, and using a research design that can isolate the role of school spending independent of family background and other environmental factors that happen out of school that affect student learning outcomes. So the key thing is, without a proper research design, the myth that school spending doesn't matter will continue to proliferate. What this work is trying to do is take a very rigorous approach using student level data. I want you to recognize that the past work that I have highlighted in previous discussions was highlighting cohorts that were born between 1950 and 1985 that were followed to the present. This work is going to highlight the experiences of the cohorts that were born since 2000, followed through the last year before the pandemic started. I want to remind you that 75%, well, let's just maybe say it this way, that up through 2000, the decade of the 70s, 80s, and 90s saw successive decades of narrowing of school spending gaps, mostly through the success of court-ordered state litigation efforts that were uneven across states in time, but certainly played a significant role in the narrowing. Since 2000, we've actually seen an increase in per pupil spending across the country, and 75% of per pupil spending disparities today actually occur between districts rather than within them. You can see an example here where I have all the states on the eve of the local control funding formula legislation that was passed in California in 2013. And on the eve of that legislation, California and the rest of the country was reeling from the Great Recession. There was a lot of hemorrhaging of funding and teacher layoffs due to the foreclosure crisis that affected property values, particularly in lower income and minority communities. You can see Pennsylvania, for example, having the most regressive funding system of the country, where their most affluent districts spend about a third more than their poor districts, despite the poor districts having much greater need with regard to a much higher proportion of English language learners, special needs children, low-income students, where the ability to ensure equal educational opportunity requires more resources, not less, to meet the higher need. You can see at this time period, California was below average or roughly in the middle of the pack with regard to school spending disparities. And what we wanted to do is look at the experience of the funding reform effort in California. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to highlight the dimensions of the local control funding formula. I should just mention, I'm greeting you from California. I wish I could be in person with you in New York, but just so that we kind of get this, not this East Coast bias, but give a little West Coast love to the fact that 1/8 of public school children are educated within the California public school system. It is the largest and most diverse state system in the country. Therefore, when we zoom in on what's happening in California with regard to the funding efforts and their efficacy of improving student learning outcomes, there is a lot of aspects that have direct implications for what we can learn with regard to lessons for the rest of the country. I'm going to highlight the funding formula that the local control funding formula involves, that I use in the research design to be able to tease out how the funding formula changed and how we can use directly through an instrumental variables approach the isolated change in spending and its effects on academic achievement for race, by race, ethnicity, by lower income status, and the like. So I'm going to outline the research design. I'm going to present the results. The results are going to proceed in a few ways. First, I'm going to show you figures that show you the before-after change in spending and academic achievement visually, because the LCFF involved an $18 billion commitment of new revenue from the state committed to school districts. And it involved a much more progressive funding formula, but it was a staggered rollout over a 7-year period. So I'm able to leverage that staggered rollout of the funding formula, $18 billion, to document its subsequent impact on student achievement using a two-stage least squares instrumental variables approach. I'm then gonna, after showing you the average effects for each grade and subject, I'm then gonna zoom back out to zero in on the distribution of those school-specific spending effects so that I can document those effects for every school in California. I'm then going to show you the heterogeneity, the amount of differences in the effectiveness of that school spending across different environments. Now, what is true is that both school resources and school practices vary substantially across US districts and schools alongside enormous achievement gaps, but there has been limited evidence that has been able to isolate what causes the effectiveness of school funding to be greater in some places versus other places. So explaining that heterogeneity is going to involve trying to identify which school input matter most, not just the what of school funding, but the how. That is it class size reductions? Is it teacher salary increases? Is it the hiring of more teaching assistants? Is it more guidance counselors? Is it new building renovations, administrative salaries, teacher professional development? What dimensions matter most in boosting learning outcomes? And then I'm going to close with the PreK synergistic effects with the elementary school spending. In California, transitional kindergarten, which is a type of universal PreK targeted to 4-year-olds of a certain eligibility status. And I'm going to document how that legislation was passed in 2010 and how it interacted with the LCFF-induced increases in elementary school spending. Okay, so that's a lot. I have a lot to get through, but I'm definitely going to have my ears open to hear any questions throughout, and Ron will certainly be empowered to not interrupt me, but interject when there needs to be some clarification and also some discussion on the way to get to the broader discussion section. So just to highlight the starting point, I want you to recognize that on the eve of the local control funding formula passage in California, this is data drawn from Sean Reardon's pioneering work that was able to put all test scores on the same NAEP normed adjusted scale. And what you see in this figure represents the scatter plot, where every dot represents every school district in the United States. And what you see along the x-axis is district disadvantage to the left, all the way to the right to the most advantaged districts socioeconomically. And you can see the dramatic gradient in academic achievement in grade level equivalents that are in the order of 2 grade levels and above when we look at more affluent districts versus poorer districts. And what I've highlighted in this figure is Massachusetts districts in maroon and California districts in white. And the purpose of highlighting that is because Massachusetts has the highest per pupil spending and among the most progressive funding formulas, whereas California, before the local control funding formula, had a much less progressive funding formula, but also had much lower spending, especially when you take into account cost of living differences, where California is much more expensive. Okay, so when you put these pieces together, what I'm trying to highlight is that what you see in the scatter plot is for each level of district socioeconomic status, students in Massachusetts are performing better than California. And a big part of that, I'm going to demonstrate through this study, is the state system of public financing of K-12 schools, including the PreK. And the narrowing of that gap is exactly what I'm going to highlight that ensued over the subsequent 7 years. This is a picture for the 2009 to 2013 period. I'm going to show you what happens in the subsequent period after these policies were changed, okay? In particular, Massachusetts stayed the same. California invoked a major $18 billion commitment over 8 years. It was communicated to states that regardless of what else happens going forward, that was going to be a committed resources from 2013 to 2019. It became fully funded by 2019. It was targeted to students with a supplemental and concentration grant. No, it was not targeted to district property wealth, but to students based on need, where student level disadvantage was the target, and it was defined as the proportion of the district that's free or reduced price lunch, English language learners, homeless, or foster youth. If whatever proportion of students in your district, unduplicated proportion that fit one of those categories, that represented high need. And that was then a targeted formula that I'm going to highlight for you next about the funding formula. It was like a base grant of $8,000 per pupil, depending on grade level. They had a requirement that the funding be at least ensuring that class sizes in the elementary school grades be less than 24 students. And they offered a supplemental grant of $1,600 for each high need student in that district. And if it was a district that had a high concentration of poverty, in this case, more than 55% of students are high need, they had a concentration grant that gives $5,300 per high need student. So that was the funding formula change that made it much more progressive. I'm going to show you visually what that looks like. And the other piece of this is that the policy change gave much greater discretion to districts of how to use that new revenue, how to use that funding. And so I'm going to be documenting some of the aspects of how the money was used and what ways in which the how the money was used affected learning outcomes the most. Okay, now what I want to highlight is districts with 55% or more high need both got the much more progressive funding formula at that point, but also were able to use those resources district-wide without with having autonomy of how to target that need. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of the, lot of media attention around the implementation and a lot of people questioning whether it was working or not, even way in advance of actual empirical data that could be brought to bear. This is actually the first comprehensive study of LCFF to date. That's in part why I'm so excited about sharing it with you today. I want you to see that before the passage of LCFF, on the eve of its passage, this is the Great Recession's hemorrhaging of teacher layoffs that was leading to significant funding declines connected to property wealth declines and state funding declines. And it wasn't except that the LCFF was passed that the restoration to prior levels and increases in a more targeted investment. Now, the reason I highlight that is because if you don't take into account the pre-existing time trend of this declining revenue that did have residual effects on reducing student achievement leading up to the LCFF, you actually will misstate the relationship between the school funding and the outcome. So this is a picture visually of the district per pupil revenue for 2012, which is the last year before LCFF is passed, in blue, and red represents the fully funded formula. So when you look at like a pre-post difference, This is grades K through 3, and the x-axis is showing you the district proportion student disadvantage. Now you should note that for African-American students and for Hispanic students, the average district proportion student disadvantage is about 70 to 75%. For non-Hispanic white students, that proportion is less than 55% in the roughly 50% range. And so you can see the funding formula having that significant chink at the 55% increasing. And you can see it each year. There's both an increase in the revenue as it rolls out, and there's a significant more progressivity in the formula by student district proportion disadvantage. Now, this is what it looks like in change form, the rollout. So this is like basically looking at the difference between the baseline 2012 and the subsequent 5 years that followed in terms of the timing of the rollout of that money. And that's exactly what we're going to use to identify the effect of funding on outcomes, this rollout of the funding by controlling for school fixed effects, birth year fixed effects, and the instrumented school spending coming from the funding formula. Now, what people underappreciate about the Every Student Succeeds Act, the federal reauthorization of ESEA in 2016, is that it had a reporting requirement that all schools, all districts report their spending at the school level, not just at the district level. And what that did and does for us is it allows us to track funding at the school level and at the district level to look at the intra-district resource allocation decisions and build an information system to link spending, school segregation, integration, and outcomes by school at the student level, but connected to the school level spending so that we can use the data to celebrate productivity superstars and schools that are adopting innovations that have a proven success of boosting learning, that we can then export those lessons learned to other schools that may not be employing those reform type of implementation. So the data, let me be clear, this is big data. This is the era of big data, but this is the biggest data project I've been able to be a part of. This is the universe of California public school students using annual data from 2004 to 2019. It's 6.5 million students each year across all K-12 grades across the 10,000 schools and roughly 1,000 districts in California. I link and match it to the finance data that's inflation adjusted from 1995 to 2019 so that I can trace out the level of funding and the type and components of school inputs from class size to teacher salary to teacher turnover at the grade year cohort level. And I link that right to test score data that is NAEP normed for each subject, math and reading for each grade, elementary school grades throughout and high school 11th grade. And I then subsequently look at high school graduation and the like, okay? So there's a lot here. I wanna just give you quickly the intuition of the research design. We're looking basically including school fixed effects and birth year fixed effects and controls for changes to the local economy that may, and I'm controlling for the proportion of the funding that was subject to restrictions and how it could be used. So I want you to think of basically the model is looking at student outcomes and student trajectories. And there's two components, right? It's the increased revenue and the increased discretion. But I'm going to be accounting for the increased discretion so that I can highlight and isolate the effect of the revenue. Now, the revenue is connected to student attributes. So I'm going to have to use a student formula change to be able to disentangle the family and student level factors that are kind of time invariant and the factors that are changing due to the funding formula so that I can do it in a two-stage least squares environment. Basically, what I want you to think about is the outcome variable, let's say for a 6th grade math achievement, where Y is student I in 6th grade and school S and district B and from birth cohort B. I want to looking at that 6th grade student achievement, I want to look at the average annual per pupil revenue that child was exposed to in their 4th grade, their 5th grade, and their 6th grade year. And I want to look at how, other things being equal, how the change in spending in their 4th, 5th, and 6th grade year on average in the annual years and the 3 years leading up to their 6th grade, what impact it had on their 6th grade student achievement. But here, what's important is I'm able to control for the 3rd grade achievement. So I'm looking at 2 children that have the same 3rd grade achievement in math and reading, but because of the timing at which they arrived at 6th grade, they experienced differential exposure to increased spending. So for example, there are children who were already in 6th grade in 2013. That cohort would not be exposed to any school funding reform increase in spending. In comparison to, say, a 6th grader from that same school who reached 6th grade in 2018, after the funding from LCFF was fully funded, they had a significantly higher level of resources in their 4th grade, 5th grade, and 5th grade year relative to the prior cohorts from the same school that didn't have access to that spending. That's the thought experiment controlling for the 3rd grade student level achievement. Again, theta S represents a vector of school fixed effects, neta B represents a vector of birth year fixed effects, and we're instrumenting for the per pupil spending via the number of years you were exposed to that increased funding and the dose. So it's both the exposure and the dose is connected to what kind of district were you. If you were a high income district, that is a affluent district, the dose was relatively low. If you were a low income district, because a lot of the funding was targeted to lower income districts, the dose was high. So I'm looking at a dose response if it's going to be consistent with the causal effect. Okay, so PPE represents the average per pupil spending annually in real 2015 dollars during the expected grades of 4 through 6, which is when they're ages 9 through 11. We do this for every grade, every subject, but I'm just giving you an example of what it would look like for 6th grade. Again, the dose, the exposure, fixed effects, birth year fixed effects. So we're just comparing kids from the same school, before and after this funding reform over and above statewide time trends. Okay, so let me remind you how big the academic achievement gap is by district student percent disadvantage before LCF is implemented. This is 3rd grade test scores. You can see the gradient that as we go from most affluent, which is further to the left, to most disadvantaged, you can see the decline in 3rd grade test scores. This is math achievement. And you can see it's on the order of, what is that? More than a standard deviation difference. But while your eye test might not be able to see this, by the 2018 year, and it was fully funded, the slope of that gradient becomes flatter, and the level of achievement at each socioeconomic status level rises significantly. Your eyes might not be able to fully see that, so in future slides, you'll see it more clearly. Okay, we see the same thing in reading. Let me show you how we trace this out with per pupil spending increases. So first, I want you to see the event study figures of the staggered timing of the spending increase. So what I'm really trying to say first is the rollout of the spending. This is an example of the average per pupil spending in grades 1st through 3rd in the first 5 years of the rollout. And you can see by year 4, relative to statewide levels, relative to school fixed effects, this is an example of a district that was 10% high need versus 70% high need. So the 70% high need is roughly is basically the average district for where Black and Latino students are. 10% low income, probably a much more affluent district. And you can see about the $10,000 increase in spending. What I'm looking for is what does it look like when we look at math achievement for 3rd graders, looking at that same event study figure. So this is the change in 3rd grade math achievement. I want you to see how there's a dose response where for each additional year of exposure to the spending, we see about a 0.14 standard deviation increase in math reading, and we do not see that when the dose is small. That is when it's the same kind of economic status of the child is the same. Every other thing is actually the same. That's not coming from the same school, but when the funding increase was relatively small, we don't really see that same increase. Now, I'm going to show you for a few grades and subjects, but the general pattern holds for every grade and every subject. So for just sake of time and just getting to the punchline, I want you to just see them for a select set of grades. This is for elementary school grade. This is third grade reading achievement. And you can see about a 0.24 standard deviation increase for kids from districts that were 70% high need who received large increases in funding relative to the same students from those cohorts that came from those same schools before the rollout of that increased funding. And you see no such effect for otherwise similar children from more affluent areas that did not get the increase in spending. You can fast forward to the middle school years. What's nice about the sixth grade is I'm able to control for third grade achievement and look at the subsequent fourth, fifth, and sixth grade spending increase. And you can see about a 0.36 standard deviation increase in math, again, to the NAEP norm scale, and it's increasing with years of exposure. We do not see that same magnitude of increase for districts that got lower spending increases. This is very consistent with the spending driving these increases in student achievement. And I should just highlight that these magnitudes are far bigger than any other prior study, at least with the kind of confidence intervals I can use with this large sample size. This is sixth grade reading achievement. Again, controlling for the third grade reading achievement, 2 children from the same third grade achievement, the subsequent increase in spending, we're talking about a 0.37 standard deviation increase in math relative to children from the same school in prior cohorts that did not get that exposure to the funding increase. And we don't see it for schools that were not eligible for that larger increase. We finally see it for, I'll show you for 8th grade math so that you can just see how when we control for 5th grade math achievement and look at the subsequent increases of funding in the 6th grade, 7th and 8th grade years, how it affected 8th grade achievement. So it's not that the funding matters only in that year, it's the way in which the sustainability of those increased spending and resources improve the trajectory of math. And here, this is 8th grade math, we're talking about a 0.4 to 0.42 standard deviation increase in math performance, where you see a similar effect for reading. I'm going to put this all together to highlight that when we look across all of the grades together, this is 3rd grade through 11th grade. The estimated effects of a $1,000 increase in per pupil spending for 3 consecutive years. So for 3rd graders, it would be like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, $1,000 increase in each of those years on 3rd grade achievement. For 7th grade, it would be the effect of a $1,000 increase in per pupil spending experienced in 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade on 7th grade math achievement. And you can see these are enormous effects. Let me give you a flavor for the magnitude. We're talking about the magnitudes for, say, middle school math achievement that we're identifying here causally are on the order of a full year of learning growth more than prior cohorts from the same school who did not have access to that spending increase. A whole year of learning growth gains more than prior cohorts. The reading achievement, while smaller, is still enormous, on the order of 0.25 in grades 6 through 8, roughly 0.2 to 0.24. That magnitude is on par with 9 months more learning gains than prior cohorts from the same school that did not have access to that funding increase. You can put it together this way and see it visually, but remember, I motivated this conversation around not just does money matter, and we can see it matters a lot, but how does it matter? And can we explore the heterogeneity? So that's what I'm coming to. But I want to first highlight that it's not just test scores we focus on. I'm not going to focus on them today, but we also look at socio-emotional development. And this is just documenting high school graduation rates, highlighting that these increases in student learning outcomes as measured by test scores was mirrored in translating into about a 5 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school for children from lower income families who were in districts that had large spending increases. You can see that dose response with years of exposure, and that we don't see when those same children are in districts that did not experience that spending increase. Okay, so next we're talking about the pathways. Okay, now pathways, I'm talking about LCFF is the funding formula change. It's affecting school spending through the progressive funding formula and the increased spending across the board. But how? Is it class size reductions? Is it teacher salaries? Is it the reductions in teacher turnover? Now, I don't have time to show it now, but we document the school spending increases led to significant reductions in class size, led to significant increases in teacher salaries, led to significant reductions in teacher turnover. And so we think that those instructional expenditure components of the spending making it to the classroom, we hypothesized that that was some of the primary drivers. But we also examined increases in guidance counselors, how many health services per student, administrative salaries, building renovations, teacher personal development. What are the main mechanisms? We try to tease out the relative contributions of these kind of major school-related factors in its being a driver for student achievement, without the power and sample size in the research design to be able to join the school spending with how the money spent, we wouldn't be able to pursue this type of analysis. So when I talk about why do effects vary, I want you to think of kind of 3 components. One is the treatment contrast, like what funding and services were received by the cohorts that got this increased funding relative to the counterfactual funding received for those same prior cohorts from the same school. What's the treatment contrast? It's similar to like, what's the dose of the change in the policy-induced funding? We want to look at it not just based on the treatment contrast, but the other C, student characteristics by race, ethnicity, by English language learner, by poverty status. And we want to look at it by school context. You want to remember, segregation I've been highlighting is a significant part of what can sometimes thwart effective school interventions. So, Ron, because I have that like flip, I feel like I don't have as good a sense on time. So my thought process is, I'm not going to tell you all the methods about how we get inside the black box, because I think that that will crowd out really important time for our discussion. But I promise there's a lot of detail about how we get inside the black box to get at not just the average school spending effects, but isolating the school-specific spending effects for every school in California. So I'm going to kind of skip over this part, but the model is basically a multi-level random coefficients model that includes accounting for school fixed effects and birth year fixed effects. So it has the same research design, but it would be like, instead of getting the average effects, we're able to drill down to look at the school-specific spending effects and the heterogeneity, that is the variance in those school-specific effects. So we're able to get the average school-specific effect, that's what I'm calling beta S, and then we're able to relate that level of school spending effectiveness to look at the LCFF-induced increases in each of these school components, class size reductions, teacher salaries. So I'm going to be looking at, for each school, what did they spend that LCFF funding on? And then I'm going to be looking at the relative contribution of each of those school inputs to the beta school effectiveness that we're getting at the school level. So this is an example. This is the histogram of the $1,000 increase in per pupil spending for 3 years, the effect of that on third grade achievement for every school in California. You can see the histogram is very much centered on a roughly 0.13, but you can see there's places that have effects as large as 0.25 in places that, you know, are smaller, but for the most part, the impacts are large. What surprised me is that when you decompose the proportion of the per pupil spending effects, roughly 3/4 of them, of those school spending effects, are differences that vary between schools within the same district. 21% are between districts. Okay, so that's highlighting the intra-district resource allocation, and particularly teacher quality, could be a component of that. Okay, now again, this is the histogram for third grade reading achievement. You can see it's centered around 0.19 standard deviation increase, and you can see districts as high as 0.35, but there's very few districts for which that received this infusement of dollars for which it didn't significantly boost third grade reading achievement. Okay, and again, a significant share of the variation in that effectiveness differs between school within district. I'm fast forwarding into 8th grade just so that you can see the sheer magnitude. Here you can see about a 0.35 standard deviation increase is the central tendency of the effect of receiving a $1,000 increase in the 6th grade, 7th, and 8th grade years on 8th grade achievement. You can see some magnitudes as big as 0.5 standard deviations. And even on the relatively smaller side, it's about 0.15. So there's no district for which this spending did not significantly boost 8th grade math achievement. That has historically been a very stubborn achievement gap. And all of this had huge ramifications for achievement gaps by race and class. And again, in this case, 58% of that was between districts, and roughly 42% of that school effectiveness difference is between schools within districts. And you see the same, big magnitude for reading. Okay, so I'm entering my close. I just have one final set of results I want to show you, which is the effects of PreK investments and the ways in which they interact with K-12 investments. Here I'm focusing on the elementary school grades. And the reason for this is that some of the heterogeneity in school effectiveness is actually based on things that happened before kids even entered school. The very fact that half of the achievement gap that we observe among third graders, half of it already was apparent at kindergarten entry. So we look at transitional kindergarten. I'll describe what transitional kindergarten, but it's a type of universal pre-K program that was launched for the first time in California in 2010. Our daughter actually was one of the first cohorts of transitional kindergarten. It's based on basically a way to ensure that school readiness and school readiness gaps can get reduced. Many of your faculty, I'm thinking mostly of Jane, Fogo, and others on your faculty that really have done pioneering work on the school readiness and the importance of pre-K and the synergistic effects and the ways it affects socio-emotional learning, cognitive development. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to be preaching to the choir because I know we've got a lot of leaders in this area before it. But what I want to highlight to you is how we document the synergistic effects. Okay, so here's what I want you to see. I promise I'm almost done. This is the year that you turn 5. In the year that you turn 5, if you were born between December 2nd and 31st, you did not have access to transitional kindergarten. But if you were born between November 1st and November 30th, if you turned 5, you normally had to wait an entire year to enter kindergarten. Transitional kindergarten policy changed and said, if you're on the cusp, that is, you're born between November 1st and November 30th, you don't have to wait a whole nother year, but rather you will get access to what's called transitional kindergarten. And the curricular content is very much geared toward a kindergarten curriculum to help them be ready. Both of these cohorts on either side of this discontinuity entered kindergarten in the exact same year. The only difference is because when they were in their womb, came out early, later, all kind of quasi-random, we never can predict exactly when, these wonderful children are born. But my point is, on either side of the cutoff, we can see, in this case, about a 60% take-up, that among eligibles, roughly 60% of eligibles. It wasn't means tested, so everybody who's born in that range gets access to transitional kindergarten. So it's basically getting a free year of pre-K. And then they subsequently all enter kindergarten in the same year. We fast forward, okay, to their 4th grade year, to their 3rd grade year. And we look at achievement, and you can see that same discontinuity. This is the December 2nd through 31st. This is the cohorts born between November 1st, November 30th. They're otherwise identical. But to the left of the discontinuity, they had access to transitional kindergarten. And you see this discontinuous jump that's statistically significant. That's on an order of about 0.08 standard deviation increase in math test scores, no fade out, right? And we see significant impacts on reading test scores in 4th grade. And we see sizable effects in 3rd grade as well, okay? Now, the last slide I wanna highlight is we take the policy-induced change from the regression discontinuity design of the new cohorts of access to pre-K via the transitional kindergarten, and we connect it to what level of funding did they have in their elementary school grades. And the idea is that synergies, positive synergies are detected. That when we look at the $1,000 increase in per pupil spending in the 2nd grade, 3rd grade, and 4th grade on 4th grade achievement, notice that there's positive effects of that, irrespective of whether you attend pre-K or transitional kindergarten in this case. But notice how if you attended transitional kindergarten, that the same $1,000 increase in per pupil spending experienced for 3 consecutive years. Notice how if you preceded that by having attended transitional kindergarten, the effects are almost double the effects that had you not. So it's the same $1,000 increase, but it's doubling the effectiveness if you attended transitional kindergarten. You see it both in the math achievement in 4th grade and in the reading achievement in 4th grade. Okay, so that's one part of the synergy I'm talking about. And finally, there's a lot of attention around pre-K access, Head Start, fades out, doesn't have any lasting effects. You hear a lot about that, but here what I'm trying to highlight here is when these children, lower income children, had access to transitional kindergarten, but they subsequently attended poorly funded schools. I want you to see that there was no lasting impact on their 4th grade achievement as measured by test scores. But when they had that same transitional kindergarten experience, and it was sustained in quality resourced, well-funded schools in their 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade years, I want you to see that then these had significant beneficial effects. Not insignificant, but replaced what was otherwise an insignificant lasting effect to something that ended up being, huge on math and reading too. This is a big part, we believe, of some of the heterogeneity in school effectiveness is actually connected to this synergy. Okay, so I said I was entering my close, so let me close with this. We endeavored to try to explain how much of the variation in school spending effectiveness can we account for via the change in school inputs. We were able to show that the biggest 3 factors that explain the heterogeneity in school effectiveness is the reductions in class size, it's the increase in teacher salaries, and it's the reduction in teacher turnover. That when those 3 things are married together, remember, 1 in 5 teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years. In high poverty schools, that ratio is about 1 in 2. The spending part is something that plays a significant role in the recruitment, retention, and professional development of teachers. Without it, you leave in its vacuum a lot of inexperienced novice teachers that a lot of minority students in particular are exposed to more often than higher income and non-Hispanic white students. So we also find, other type of inputs matter, like guidance, counseling, health services, teacher professional development, but the largest components are class size, teacher salaries, teacher turnover. So I need to hand back over to Ron. There's many next steps. I'm going relatively quickly, and I had a little technical mishap that you all were very patient with me in the Zoom environment, but we have various directions where we're looking at social-emotional development and adjoining for the first time a holistic approach to learning outcomes, not just leaning on test scores to frame, what connotes good learning trajectories. And I guess maybe I would close on the last time I was with you, at least last time I have had an opportunity to give my book talk. You remember I closed with showing you that for prior cohorts, those cohorts would have been 25 a generation ago. But for those cohorts, for poor children, the long-run effect of K-12 spending doubled when preceding by access to Head Start and quality pre-K. These results, fast forward 25 years in terms of the cohort, we're seeing the same pattern true today, being experienced by today's children. That prior work looked at wages and high school graduation rates and college going rates and poverty and incarceration. And I need to stop. So thank you for your time. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I'm sorry if I ran over. Ron, forgive me. Thank you.
Well, so Rucker, there's absolutely no need to forgive us. It was really a tremendous set of results. So
would it be okay if I stop sharing screen?
Yeah.
Or what would you prefer?
Yeah, please do. So we can have be more relaxed. So I was trying to monitor the questions, and let me try to pitch you some so that, because they clarify or give you opportunity to clarify some of the results. First of all, your ideal about rollout, it's not saying that the rollout was decreasing the number of disadvantaged students, but instead it was increasing the resources going to schools in which there were more disadvantaged students. Is the latter?
Yeah, so the whole idea is we're gonna keep everything else constant. Mm-hmm. Like the proportion of kids that are disadvantaged, that are low income, their family circumstances, we're gonna control for all those things, and those things are all gonna be held the same. Mm-hmm. Via the research design. The only thing that's gonna be changing is that their school environment is being infused with more dollars. Okay. In some districts more than others. And so that's the way that we're able to disentangle that. But yes, the family and familial environments are staying the same. Mm-hmm. The proportion of that district's like students that are disadvantaged or coming from high need family environments, or I should say more disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged, those are all staying the same.
Okay, a second question, and let me try to spin it for the person who asked the question. So your results about how the benefits of the LFF spending were higher for children in the discontinuity analysis, where you looked at the effects for children who, because of the discontinuity, were enabled to basically get pre-K earlier than they would have otherwise. This is a question. Someone asks, she lives in a school district in which there is very little, there's lots of diversity, lots of generously funded schools, but children are coming from households with very different economic status. And she was wondering, yet there are very large differences in their academic achievement. What would you attribute that to? And I think your results suggest that these results speak to that, because they suggest that children who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds entering school, that is, have lower levels of readiness, gain more as a consequence of having these additional resources to push them forward.
Yes, so that's all very astute. I think what's important to say is when we see the achievement gaps, they're not immutable. Mm-hmm. They are a reflection directly of educational opportunity gaps that preceded them, and many of them preceding them into the pre-K years. So what we're talking about is, if you want to know something about the effectiveness of schools, you have to look at the growth rates in student learning, not the levels. Because even with how optimistic these results show, I'm not saying the lower income students are now outperforming the most affluent students in that school. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is the growth rates are very much strongly tracking the funding increases. to demonstrate that those learning gaps can be narrowed significantly with intervention. The only other thing I would just say, Ron, on this point is the counterfactual when we don't expand, say, public investments in pre-K, for middle-class families and more affluent families, they generally have access to some private care setting. Mm-hmm. Lower income families without that public investment typically are relegated to home care. And a lot of those children are coming from more single parent families. And certainly Ron is a renowned scholar on family, family structure and all of those components. So I'm not going to elaborate on that, but I think what I'm just saying is it's important to think about what would the counterfactual care setting be in the absence of the intervention. And for low income children, it's typically a less nurturing sometimes and less developmentally of getting school ready kind of aspects.
So, so you answered one of Jane Walfogel's questions, but your voice dropped. The question had to do with on what were the schools spending that seemed to have the largest effects? And I recall class size, teacher salaries, and your voice dropped. It was teacher turnover.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it's really in the instructional expenditure lane. And I'm just going to say one little cautionary note. Sometimes, like California is a place where there's a lot of pension debt that is like arrearing in school districts. So they have a large pension debt that they're trying to pay down. And so sometimes we have these big funding reform efforts and the money doesn't make it to the classroom, not because it's being wasted, but there's a lot of pension debt. And then when it doesn't make it to the classroom and then we don't see significant increases in student achievement, we prematurely say the funding didn't matter. You have to follow the money to make sure how the money spent does matter too. So, we document that in places that it went to building renovation, which is an important thing, especially in this pandemic, right? Where, the ventilation systems in some schools are so old that they're really making students kind of a contagion is very vulnerable for kids. So those renovations are really important, but they're not the kind of thing that translate into improvements in test scores, at least not typically. So we shouldn't necessarily think of those not worthwhile of our investment if they don't always lead to test score gains. You have to kind of think about what type of input was invested. And so that's part of what the pursuit of following the money and not just kind of saying, does money matter or doesn't it? But when, how, and for whom.
So let me take the chair's prerogative. My question related to Jane's question. So these are early analyses of this program, and there is wide variations in the ways in which schools are spending the money. Are they at this juncture learning from one another about when schools have higher achievements? Is there a process going on in California where school districts are reading these data and schools are changing the way within California they're spending this money because they learn from other similar schools? What is more effective?
So directly that motivation.
That's the money.
How I was able to secure this data use agreement with the California Department of Education. It was primarily, I want you to think of you all have a lot of scholars who are leaders in fragile family study, mixed methods, quantitative, qualitative, and really doing a lot of work that has just, my first time going to Ron's house was literally when I was coming out of graduate school and he was hosting a fragile families workshop and the data had just come out. So I remember these things vividly, but the reason I make mention of it is because my interest initially was, I want to use the big data to have the aerial view of the causal effect, but then I want to identify the outliers, the positive outliers, meaning the places that are beating the odds. They're having these funding increases and their student achievement is growing far more than the typical. I want to send a team of qualitative interviews in those classrooms, in those districts to figure out, getting inside the black box, what are they doing? and then work to try to export that knowledge to other school district leaders, other practitioners that are really leading some of these reform efforts. So the idea is not to use the data to just punish or to, but to incentivize, think about like the charter school movement, in my view, a lot of innovation without evaluation. Mm-hmm. And innovation without evaluation is a recipe for inefficiency. My esteemed colleague, Linda Darling-Hammond, has often emphasized that. But my point is, we want to not just do the evaluation, but we want to export the knowledge of what's working when we can have enough sample size and enough power to detect what's working when. And I would say it's not so that we have a formulaic recipe that one size fits all, because many schools have very different needs that have to be catered to in different ways. If you have a lot of English language learners, there's a very different way in which you need to think about bilingual instruction. There's different ways in which the trajectory of outcomes need to map differently. And also guidance counselors and health services, better, children with better health are, healthier children are better learners. These are all connected. So yeah, I'll stop there. But certainly, I'm not saying the pandemic is not important for many, many, many other way more significant life things. But one of the things that the pandemic did do is it ended the last year of this analysis. Because basically, after 2019, everything is like a wash. I mean, unfortunately, all of the games that are so optimistic and that I'm so passionate about, unfortunately, a lot of those gains are being reversed because of the digital divide. The essential workers, where are they? Black and brown folk in communities that don't have those same resources, that are having to deal with a pandemic, that the care, so unfortunately.
But Rucker, obviously, the lessons this study begins to provide about what's important and how you can fast forward the learning trajectories of children could certainly provide direction for the funding that's coming in as a consequence of the act. So there's enough. So let me, I live across the street from the Apollo, so I'm feeling as if we're both going to get yanked in a minute. A couple of questions. We have our students who are in social work, many of them work in the education space and are deeply concerned. Do you think that they can play a role in through working in underfunded schools, which many of them do, helping those schools make better assessments so that some of the ways in which some of the implications of this study can be implemented in other places in order to to help schools in our area or schools where our students are working make the kinds of advancements that are being seen in California?
Yeah, I had an opportunity to present to the National School Superintendents Roundtable, which is a network of all the leading school superintendents across the country. And when I present this kind of work in their environment, they're like, yeah, tell us something we don't know. I mean, but what I mean by that is they're like, no, we understand these things matter, and we need to be able to have more of an understanding from people outside of the school context to better appreciate that guidance counselors and other type of support that kids need. Like, there's a lot of trauma that's happening even right now that kids experience, that when it goes untreated, it kind of manifests in behavior problems in school. But it's really about, do we have enough support of kids' needs, not just the academic that you might see in a test score, but the social emotional learning that, while I didn't emphasize that in this discussion, is equally critical, even though it's harder to measure. So I guess I would say, in California, we've had this movement to put health clinics within schools to create more of an ability to diagnose and detect learning disability, learning challenges, and support kids socio-emotional to kind of connect the pediatric care access to be closer proximity. And I don't have evidence on this myself, but in other people's work, those are parts that I feel like is connected to the synergy. So when you hear me say synergy, I mean the social workers, the health workers, the education, the after-school programs, the mentorship, right? And I didn't mention like teacher diversity. I didn't mention multicultural curriculum, right? Those are the other pieces that what integration looks like when it's real.
So, Rucker, so, back to the, expert question, which is, do you think that the lessons emerge? I realize that you're just generating these results and you have an infinite amount of data. You'll be at this until, well, anyway. Will it have an influence on other states pursuing the kinds of spending changes, disconnecting the distribution of, the segregation of wealth from the segregation of educational? Will it diversify funding? Will other states follow this lead? I noticed, for example, in Pennsylvania, I'm coming across this in some of my work. It surprised me that Pennsylvania's spending on unemployment insurance was so wildly segregated, and it looks like the education results are the same. Do you have hope that as you disseminate these results, other states will follow?
Well, so you mentioned,
what's the barrier?
So you mentioned Pennsylvania. I was involved in their current state litigation suit to provide evidence that how they're funding. So I think that's like, I don't take those responsibilities lightly. I think that that's an opportunity for, the disruption of the status quo in that way. But I also think that like the federal outlay of an unprecedented increase in Title I funding, we're talking about like something like, $120 billion increase, much of that through Title I funding targeted to lower income districts to do with the learning loss mitigation response. The question is like, one-time increases like that, schools are typically very cautious about committing instructional expenditures that are reoccurring when they receive that, because when the federal investment goes away, what are they going to do with the teachers they hired? They can't sustain it. So I don't always blame the schools if they can't know how consistent that flow is going to be. And so I think that was distinctive about LCFF is it was an 8-year commitment.
Okay.
And the schools therefore could, in that bold curricular reforms and bold instructional expenditure investments, because they knew it wasn't going to go away the next year due to some, partisanship, political kind of fallout. So yeah, I'm hopeful that this pandemic, the racial reckoning, the 3+ generations of incrementalism, I want and hope and pray that we seize this moment and that this not be returning to normal, but a new normal that has bold policy prescriptions that include school funding, PreK, and that the state systems learn from one another. And that the continuity between the research, policy, and practice partnerships unify in a way that breaks down the silos that we see across the various parts that inequality takes hold. So,
well, Rucker, this has been a truly tremendous presentation. I think it's been of value both to those of us on the policy side who tend to be very quantitative in our work and believe in causal inference, but I also think our audience includes many people on the advocacy side, on the clinical side, and I'm just sitting on the edge of my seat. We only have 2 minutes to go. Do you have a final thought that you'd like to share with us? And then, and I want to be the first to thank you for a really tremendous presentation. I would just say, I'm proud of you, brother. It's amazing.
That means a lot coming from you. I think you deserve the last word. I want to thank Dean Begg again for inviting me. I want to thank you, Ron. You've been an inspiring scholar for me for many years, and I want to give Virtual hugs to Jane Wildfogel and the rest of your talented faculty and group who I have a lot of admiration for. Thank you again. I hope that we can be in person the next time we see one another. And I think that we have a lot of work to do. And I also think that work is doable. And I'm excited about what the next era of reform, equity-based progress that centers race and centers equity going forward. Thank you.
Well said. Melissa, I will leave the last word to you.
I appreciate that, Ron. Thank you. Professor Johnson, I know everyone here joins me in saying that was a fascinating and an incredibly heartening presentation. I can't recall having seen such really startling effects and compelling outcomes in years. It had to be real. I just want to say too, it had to be really challenging to harness these data sources and extract that from them. But through your efforts, you've made it impossible to argue this point about the value of these investments. So thank you for that extraordinary work. Thank you, Dr. Mincy, for moderating so beautifully. Together, you've given us so much to think about and to act on. So thanks to everyone for joining us.